When the light shifted, Marcus could see the shock and anger on the older man's face. "What are you doing here?" Georgia demanded. "Have you been following me?" "I saw you speeding out of town and got concerned," Marcus said, moving carefully along the trail toward him. "It's dangerous out here at night. What are you doing with that bag?" "You said it contained remains from the church cemetery." The Reverend didn't answer. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of the river far below. "You know, don't you?" Reverend George finally said, his voice low and tense. Marcus was still confused, the puzzle pieces not quite fitting together in his mind. "No, what?" "Do not pretend." The Reverend snapped. The wail of police sirens suddenly cut through the night air. Reverend George's eyes widened. "You called the police." He gasped. The plastic bag dropped from his hand, landing with a thud on the wooden trail as it hit the ground. Something solid inside made a distinct noise that soiler animal remains wouldn't make. Taking advantage of the Reverend's shock, Marcus lunged forward and grabbed bedleg. Looking inside, he saw it contained not only soil from the grave, but also two books covered in grave dust. Even in the dim light, he recognized them immediately by their covers. His father's sermon notebook from 1977 and his personal diary, the exact matches to the other volumes he had at home. "You hid these from me?" Marcus said, anger rising in his chest. "You wanted to get rid of them? And those weren't dog remains at the cemetery where they were my father's, weren't they? You were going to throw his remains off this cliff into the river below with rest of the evidence." Police cars pulled into the lookout area, their flashing lights illuminating the scene in pulses of red and blue. Detective Miller's voice called out from above. "Police, stay where you are, Reverend." George looked wildly from Marcus to the approaching officers. With a sudden movement, he climbed over the safety fence that separated the trail from the cliff edge. "No," Marcus shouted, dropping the bag and rushing forward. "Don't do this. This is better than facing arrest and shame." The Reverend muttered, preparing to jump. Marcus grabbed for him but missed as Reverend George leaned forward into the abyss. Two officers who had raced down the stairs lunged forward and caught his arms, pulling him back. Despite his struggles and pleas to let him go, "You won't meet your God's judgment so fast," one officer said as they dragged him back over the fence. "You'll face the judgment of the world first." Detective Miller radioed for backup to arrest Pastor Harold at the church, suspecting he was also involved. The scene collecting the bag and its contents as evidence. Reverend George was read his rights and placed in a police car. Detective Miller approached Marcus, who was still shaking from the confrontation. "I told you not to approach him," she said sternly, but her expression softening his distress. "But I understand why you did. We need you to come to station to identify these items properly." Marcus nodded, still processing what had just happened. "He would have thrown my father's ashes and remains away if I hadn't been here," he paused. Then after he calmed himself, he added, "IHF. One favor to ask. Could Simone call the hospital and let the nurse know I'll be late visiting the boy? I promised I'd return with the communion. We'll make sure they get the message," Detective Miller assured him as they climbed back up to the parking area. Marcus looked back at the cliff edge, thinking how close they had come to losing critical evidence and perhaps the final answers about what had happened to his father 25 years ago. They drove back to the police station. Marcus, following the police cars at the station, he saw Reverend George Bung processed for booking, and to his surprise, Pastor Harold was already there in handcuffs as well, being led to a holding cell. Detective Miller took Marcus to a conference room where the evidence was being carefully laid out on a table. The two books, the 1977 sermon notebook and his father's personal diary, church finance textbook. Marcus had borrowed the grave soil, which contained bone fragments and what appeared to be part of a human skull, and the shovel. Marcus stared at the bone fragments in horror. "Is that we believe these are your father's remains?" Detective Miller sagely. "We'll need to confirm with DNA testing, of course." Marcus felt lightheaded but managed to stay composed. "What happens now? We need your statement about what you've observed today, and we'll need you to formally identify these items as potentially belonging to your father." For the next hour, Marcus gave his statement, recounting everything from the morning's call about the discovery in the forest to the confrontation at Eagle Point Lookout. He explained his suspicions about financial impropriety at the church, based on the notes in Thyphonet's book. Meanwhile, forensic technicians were carefully examining the evidence. One officer approached with the personal diary, handling it with extreme care. "This has suffered major damage," the technician explained. "The leather cover has severe deterioration, cracked and rotted from years. Underground, the paper inside has swelled and stuck together in a solid pulpy block in many places. There's extensive mold and mildew sections black. It's extremely fragile. Can you read any of it?" Detective Miller asked. "It's a miracle it's not completely gone." The technician replied, "We're handling it delicately, but we can make out some faint handwriting among the broken and rotted pages. Using specialized tools, they carefully separated a few pages that were less damaged." Marcus leaned in to see his Father's handwriting, faded but still discernible, cannot ignore this any longer. The missing funds are now over $10. When confronted privately, Harold and George denied everything, but the evidence is undeniable. I've prayed for guidance on how to proceed without publicly shaming them, but they must be held accountable. I have to say it again, it's honestly a miracle. This pad revived in such condition? One officer remarked, and the fact that the finance book was just sitting there on the top shelf of the church library, Harold or George must have thought it was safe, especially after erasing their names from the page. This really feels like divine intervention. They might have buried these books later than the body. Another suggested otherwise they would be totally unrecognizable. By now they'd earned the sermon notebook next, which was in considerably better condition. This was likely kept in Neckirch all these years, Detective Miller theorized, probably stored somewhere dry until recently when they decided to dispose of it. The notebook contained Reverend Elijah Freeman's Sunday sermons from January through April 1977. In the weeks before, his topics had increasingly focused on honesty, integrity, redemption, and forgiveness. One sermon outlined from early April 1977 was titled "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love," based on Matthew 18 to 1517. Marcus read his father's notes. 1. We see wrongdoing, especially within the church. We have a responsibility to address it with both truth and grace first, privately, then with witnesses, and finally, if necessary, before the congregation. This is not about punishment, but about restoration. The processing took several hours as they worked in Officer Entereth's room with an update from the interrogation room's pastor. Harold is still denying most charges, the officer reported, but Reverend George broke down completely. Been crying and saying he deserves to die? The officer hesitated, then continued. George has confessed. He says he and Harold, as church elders, deeply resented your father, Mr. Freeman, partly because of his race. This was the 1970s in rural Arkansas, but mainly because he threatened to expose their embezzlement of church funds. Marcus sat down heavily. The officer continued, according to George, your father gave them an ultimatum: either confess their sin in front of the congregation and withdraw from the church, or he would expose them himself. The following Sunday, thought Friday evening in 1977, after a heated confrontation in the church office, Harold and George attacked your father in the church basement. The officer's voice was professional, but gentle. George admitted that they strangled him and then wrapped his body in an old robe from the church sacristy. They buried him secretly in Neckirch Cemetery, but not in a marked grave. Instead, they desecrated an older grave for a deceased dog belonging to a congregation member, burying your father's body underneath in a shallow grave covered by tree roots, intending to hide the body in plain sight but undisturbed. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to process the horror of what he was hearing. They decided to bury the evidence far away from the body. The officer continued. They prepared that old Adidas sports bag we found to transport the robe, Bible, and some personal items. They paid someone with church money, tottig under the stump of a large tree in the dense forest, a tree that had been cut down for timber by local loggers long ago. That way they would still know which location it was in case they needed to retrieve or move the evidence. The man covered it with soil to hide it all this time. Why has no one, the police, ever questioned their story? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. Detective Miller shook her head. They admitted they used their influence to stall and misdirect investigations, claiming your father had left voluntarily. That community, already racially divided, wasn't inclined to push for a deeper investigation. After years, the case went cold, becoming just a town rumor and family tragedy. She placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The way you discovered your father's remains and these books, it does seem like a miraculous intervention. Mr. Freeman. Marcus stared at his father's sermon notebook, at the words written in a steady hand about confronting evil with love and truth. Even in those final days, his father had been trying to do the right thing, to handle the situation with integrity and grace. What happens now? Marcus asked. We'll charge them with murder, obstruction, of justice, and embezzlement, Detective Miller replied, with George's confession and the evidence we've gathered. They'll likely spend the rest of their lives in prison, and my father's remains, once the investigation is complete and DNA confirms their history, will be able to give him a proper burial. Marcus nodded, grateful at least that after 25 years, his father would finally rest in peace, his name cleared of any suspicion of abandonment or suicide. Divine intervention, he murmured, looking at the evidence spread before him. Mabso. After finishing at the police station, Marcus left for the hospital. Desky had long since darkened to full night, and visiting hours were technically over, but the nursing staff made an exception when he explained the circumstances at the hospital. He met with Robbie again and his guardians. The boy's aunt and uncle looked tired but concerned, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs beside his bed. Mr. Freeman The woman stayed standing to greet him. Robbie told us what you did. Thank you for bringing him here. Marcus introduced himself properly, and to his surprise, the guardians recognized his name Freeman, like the pastor who disappeared years ago. The uncle asked. Marcus nodded. That was my father. I thought the name sounded familiar, the man said. That case was big news around here. Even years later, Robbie was sitting up in bed looking bitter than he had at the cemetery. His fever had come down with medication, though he still looked pale. Where have you been? The boy asked, his voice stronger. Then before I was waiting for you. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed. I'm sorry I'm late, Robbie. Something important happened and I had to help the police. Are you a police officer too? Robbie asked. Why did Marcus smiled? No, just someone who was in the right place at the right time. He took out the communion set that the young church staff member had given him hours earlier. Robbie's aunt looked skeptical. There's no pastor here to lead us in the ritual. She said. Marcus met her eyes. Even though I am not a pastor, not a perfect man, just a sinner with a lot of flaws. Our faith is enough God, Israel, and he is always present watching over our lives. The aunt's expression softened, and she nodded with careful reverence. Marcus opened the communion set and placed the elements on the tray table that swung over Robbie's bed. He spoke the familiar words of institution that he had heard his father speak. Hundreds of times he broke the bread and gave pieces to Robbie and his guardians, taking a piece for himself as well. He poured the grape juice into small cups and distributed them as they took communion together in that quiet hospital room. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, a light returning after 25 years. Darkness after they finished. Robbie looked at him curiously. Will I see you again? I think so, Marcus replied. Maybe not long after this if you and your aunt and uncle want to visit Mount Olive Baptist Church. I have a feeling they might need some help there in the coming days. Robbie smiled and reached out for a hug. I want to be a kind man like you when I grow up, he whispered as Marcus left the hospital later. That night he found himself offering a prayer of thanks. The first sincere prayer he had prayed in 25 years. He admitted that he had been wronged to resent God all this time. He reflected on how the day had unfolded, how a sick boy in a cemetery had inadvertently led him back to the church, how his forgotten notebook had given him reason to return, how each small decision had led him closer to the truth about his father. God had used this little boy unknowingly, and because Marcus had decided to serve and help even in the midst of his own pain, God had opened the way that led him to discover the truth about his father's fate. He thought about how evil plans and cover-ups had persisted for decades, but in the end, truth and goodness had triumphed. The God his father had served faithfully had not abandoned him after all. Marcus drove home under a sky filled with stars, making plans in his mind. Once the investigation was complete, he would give his father a proper burial and memorial service. He would reconnect with congregation at Mount Olive, many of whom had probably never known the truth about their beloved pastor's dispersion, and perhaps, just perhaps, he might find his own way back to faith. Despite his father's tragedy, but because of the integrity and courage his father had shown in his final days, Marcus pulled into his driveway. He looked up at the night sky and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." After 25 years of anger and doubt, Marcus Freeman had finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. His father was gone, but the truth had been revealed. Justice would be served, and remarkably faith had been restored.